The winter of 1812 came to Ravenmore as a rumor comes to a great house, quietly and everywhere at once, seeping under the doors of the shut-up London mansion until even the dust in the empty rooms seemed to be listening. For 10 years that house had worn a single word as a widower wears black. And the word was murderer. No one had proven it. No one had ever answered it. It had simply been repeated at 10,000 dinner tables until repetition became a kind of proof, and the man who lived behind those cold windows learned that a rumor, left long enough in the dark, grows heavier than any truth. They called him the Duke of Ravenmore, and they said he had sent his young first wife to an early grave. Isobel had died a decade past, in the spring, and by summer the whispering had already buried her a second time and put the spade in her husband's hand. No physician's word, no coroner, no evidence had ever been laid against him. There had only ever been the whispering, and the whispering had been enough. Ballrooms emptied around him. Mothers turned their daughters by the elbow. In 10 years no hand had been offered to him in friendship, and he had stopped, long ago, expecting that one ever would. Into the county that January came a girl who owned nothing but her name and the 2 gowns that hung in her borrowed wardrobe. Clara Denton was 26, orphaned at 19, and taken in by her aunt, not out of love, but out of the appearance of it. And she had learned in 7 years of unpaid service exactly what she was worth to the household of Mrs. Harding. A pair of useful hands, a shawl carrier, a chaperone for the family's true jewel. That jewel was her cousin Cecily, gold-haired and 18 and radiant, and it was for Cecily's sake that the Hardings had come to the grandest assembly the county would hold that season. "You will stand where I can see you, Mrs." Harding told Clara in the carriage, "and you will hold Cecily's fan and her wrap, and you will not speak unless a lady speaks to you first, which she will not. You are here to be useful, Clara, not to be seen. That gray thing you are wearing has been turned twice already, and it shows. Try, at least, to stand near a wall." "Yes, Aunt," Clara said. "And whatever you do," her aunt added, lowering her voice as the lights of the great house swung into the carriage windows, "you will keep well clear of Ravenmore himself. He will be there. He is invited everywhere and welcome nowhere, and a girl with no name and no fortune cannot afford so much as to be seen looking at a man they call a murderer. Do you hear me?" "I hear you," Clara answered, and she did. But she had also learned something in her 7 quiet years that her aunt had never troubled to learn, which was that the world condemned on rumor and rewarded on nothing at all, and that she had been on the wrong side of a whisper often enough to distrust every whisper she had not tested with her own eyes. The assembly rooms of Ravenmore's county seat were the brightest thing Clara had ever seen. 100 candles burned in the great chandeliers and threw their honey light down onto polished floors and gilded chairs, onto white shoulders and jewels and the wide skirts of women who had never turned a gown in their lives. The music was already playing when the Hardings entered, and Cecily was swept at once into the warm center of it, leaving Clara against the wall with an armful of shawl and a fan she was not permitted to use for herself. And then, near the middle of the evening, Clara saw the room do a strange thing. It drew back. It happened all at once, as water draws back from a stone dropped into still shallows. A ring of empty floor opened in the very heart of the assembly, polished and gleaming and entirely bare. And in the center of that widening ring stood one man. Alone, he was tall and dark, his hair worn a shade too long, near black in the candlelight, and he was dressed with severe plainness in a black tailcoat among all that color. He stood perfectly still while the fine guests drifted back from him as though he carried a fever, and behind their raised fans the ladies whispered, and the gentlemen murmured, and not one soul in that blazing room would stand within 10 feet of the silent Duke. Clara watched the fear move across the floor like a draft, and something in her went very quiet and very certain. She did not decide to do it. She would say, long afterward, that there had been no deciding in it at all, only a knowing, the same knowing that tells a hand it has touched something hot. She set Cecily's shawl down upon a gilded chair, and she set the fan on top of it, and she stepped out of the wall of onlookers into the cleared and fearful space, and she walked. The length of that floor was the longest distance she had ever crossed. She felt the whispering die behind her as she passed, felt heads turn, felt the fans go still one by one like a field of birds settling. She did not hurry, and she did not slow. She walked to the man standing alone at the center of the county's contempt, and she stopped an arm's length from him. And she looked up into a face that had forgotten what it was to be looked at, and she did the one unthinkable thing. She offered him her bare hand. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was not loud, but in the silence it carried to every corner of the room. "They are not dancing this one. Would you stand up with me?" The music died mid-phrase. A fiddle's note broke off and hung in the air and was gone, and after it came a silence so complete that Clara could hear the candle flames. The Duke looked down at the hand held out to him as though it were a thing out of a language he had stopped believing existed. For 10 years no willing hand had reached toward him. For 10 years he had schooled his face to expect nothing, and the schooling failed him now, all at once, in front of the whole assembled county. Something moved behind his storm-gray eyes, quick and unguarded, before he could stop it, and Clara saw it, and did not look away. "You have made a mistake," he said, low. "You do not know who I am." "I know precisely who you are," Clara answered. "You are the man the whole room has just stepped away from. That is the only thing about you I know for certain, and it is not enough to make me step away too." For the length of a held breath he did not move. Then, slowly, as a man reaches for something he does not trust himself to touch, he lifted his hand and set it beneath hers, and closed it. And the warmth of a living palm against his own was so strange to him that Clara felt the small tremor of it, and pretended, for his sake, that she had not. Somewhere along the far wall, a woman gasped. Somewhere a fan snapped shut, and at the front of the drawn-back crowd, a fair-haired gentleman with a narrow, handsome, watchful face went suddenly pale and lifted his own hand halfway, as if to stop a thing already done. Clara did not know his name yet. She would learn it soon enough. His name was Varel, and of every soul in that blazing room, he was the only one who had reason to fear a hand offered to the man they called a murderer. But that was later. Now there was only the floor, and the two of them upon it, and the music that stumbled and then, uncertainly, began again. They stood up together for that dance, and the county watched every step of it, and Clara felt the Duke's hand at the small of her back, not gripping, barely touching, present as a question he did not know how to ask. "Why," he said, "when the figure of the dance brought them close, would you do such a thing? You will be ruined for it. You must know that." "I am a poor relation in a twice-turned gown, Your Grace," Clara said. "I was ruined for the crime of being born without money long before tonight. There is very little left in me to ruin." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, a thing he had plainly not done in a long while. "That is either the bravest thing I have heard in 10 years, he said, "or the most foolish." "It may be both," she said, I find the two are often the same thing wearing different coats. And there, in the middle of the ruined and staring room, the Duke laughed. It was a short, startled sound, rusty from disuse, and it undid him more than her hand had. Because a man who laughs cannot be feared, and a man who cannot be feared is only a man. Across the room, Mrs. Harding had gone the color of ash. She came for Clara before the dance had properly ended, seizing her niece's arm the instant the music released her and drawing her toward a curtained alcove with a grip that would leave marks by morning. Cecily trailed behind, wide-eyed and delighted and appalled all at once. "Have you lost your reason entirely?" Mrs. Harding hissed. "Do you know what you have done? You have stood up, in front of every family that matters in this county, with a man who put his own wife in the ground. You have attached the Harding name to a murderer's arm." "I have attached nothing to anyone," Clara said. "I danced one dance with a man no one has proven guilty of anything at all." "Proven." Her aunt said the word as though it were something Clara had dragged in on her shoe. "Nobody needs it proven. Everybody knows. That is how the world works, you ungrateful creature, and you have just learned it the hard way, and you have taught it to Cecily besides. We leave at dawn. You will be sent back to the country by the first coach, and you will not disgrace this family a second time." "At dawn," Clara repeated. "At dawn," said Mrs. Harding, "and be glad I do not put you out tonight." Clara inclined her head and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that her aunt would hear, and because she had learned long ago that dignity is the one possession no one can turn twice. But as she was steered toward the cloakroom, she felt, across the whole width of that bright and whispering room, a pair of storm-gray eyes upon her, and she did not think she imagined the weight of them. She was not sent home at dawn. The reason arrived at the Hardings' rented lodgings the following forenoon in the person of a very old woman in an unfashionable but very fine pelisse, who did not send up a card so much as announce herself, and who turned out to be Lady Augusta, the Duke's great-aunt, 80 years old and afraid of precisely nothing living or dead. "You are the Harding woman," she said to Clara's aunt, seating herself uninvited in the best chair. "And this gray creature standing by the window is the girl who offered my great-nephew her hand last night, while 300 cowards held their breath. Come here, child. Let me look at you." Clara came, and stood, and let herself be looked at. "Well," said Lady Augusta at last, "you are not a beauty. You have a sensible face and a straight back, and you did not blush when I called you gray, which tells me you have been called worse and survived it. Why did you do it?" "Because no one else would," Clara said. "That is not a reason. That is a description. Then I have no reason, my lady," Clara said. "I only knew that I would not join a crowd damning a man none of them had ever asked to speak for himself. I have been on the wrong end of a whisper. I know what it costs and what it is worth, which is nothing." The old woman studied her for a long moment. Then she turned to Mrs. Harding without warmth. "I am taking your niece into my household for the remainder of the season," she said. "As my companion, she will be paid, which is more than you have ever done for her, and she will be under my roof and my protection, and you will make no objection, because if you do, I will tell everyone in this county precisely how you came by the diamonds you are wearing, which are, if I am not mistaken, your late sister's and not your own." Mrs. Harding made no objection, and so Clara Denton, who had come to the county to carry a fan, remained in it as the companion of the fiercest old woman in England, and could not, however her family wished it, simply vanish. She was bound now to the story she had walked into. The county could not look away from her, and the Duke, it seemed, could not either. Cecily came to see her 3 days later, slipping away from her mother on the pretense of a fitting, and she stood in Lady Augusta's morning room, turning her gloves over and over in her hands. "Everyone is talking of nothing else," Cecily said. "Everyone. Clara. Mama says, you have ruined us. She says no respectable man will look at me now that my own cousin has danced with a murderer in front of the whole county." "And do you believe that?" Clara asked. "I do not know what I believe. I believe you have always been kinder to me than I have ever once been to you, and I have lain awake 3 nights wondering why. And I think it is because you decided a long time ago what sort of person you meant to be, and you have simply been her, whether anyone was watching or not. I could not have crossed that floor." Cecily's chin trembled. "I want you to know that I know that about myself now. I would have stood by the wall and been glad it was not me." "Most people would," Clara said gently. "There is no shame in it. The shame is only in pretending afterward that you would have done otherwise, and I do not think you will pretend. That is more than most manage. Was he kind to you, the Duke?" "He was surprised," Clara said. "I do not think anyone has been simply kind to him in a very long while, and he had forgotten what he was meant to do with it. That is not the same thing as cruelty, Cecily, though the county cannot tell them apart." Cecily looked at her for a long moment. "I hope he chooses you," she said suddenly, fiercely, surprising them both. "I hope he chooses you, and I hope it is in front of everyone, and I hope Mama has to curtsy to you to the end of her days." "Cecily, I do," Cecily insisted, and then she laughed, a little wetly, and pressed Clara's hand, and for the first time in 7 years, the 2 cousins were something near to friends. He came to Lady Augusta's rented house within the week, and then again. And then it became a thing that happened. The Duke arriving in the late afternoon on the excuse of visiting his great-aunt and finding, each time, that his great-aunt was conveniently occupied and her gray-gowned companion was not. "She does this on purpose," Clara told him once, in the long library where the winter light came thin and clear through tall windows. "She arranges to be elsewhere the moment you are announced." "I know," the Duke said. "She has been arranging things since before I was born. It is her only real pleasure." He stood at the far end of the room, keeping a careful distance, as he always did, as though he had learned that his nearness frightened people and had not yet been told it no longer frightened her. "It does not trouble you? To be left alone with me? Should it? They would tell you so." "They tell me a great many things," Clara said. "I have found it useful to check them against what I see. And what I see, Your Grace, is a man who stands as far from me as the room allows, and measures his words, and watches the door as though he expects to be thrown out of his own life at any moment. I do not find that frightening. I find it sad." He was quiet for a moment. "You are very direct. I have never had the luxury of being anything else. Flattery costs money, and I have never had any." "What was she like?" Clara asked him, another afternoon, when the fire had burned low and neither had risen to ring for more coal. "Your wife, Isabel. No one ever says her name. They only use it to hang you with." She watched him go still, as he had gone still in the ballroom, and she thought he would not answer, and then he did. "She was kind," he said, "kinder than I deserved. She was ill, Clara, for the last 2 years of her life, an illness in the blood the doctors could not name and could not stop, and she wasted, and she died, and there was nothing in the wide world I could do but sit beside her and watch it happen. And when she was gone, her cousin stood at the graveside and wept very prettily, and within the month it was being said in every house in London that I had done it, that I had wanted her fortune, or her freedom, or God knows what. I did not want anything but her, and she was the one thing I could not keep. He looked at his own hands. I stopped defending myself in the second year. There is no defense against a thing that was never charged. You cannot answer a whisper in a courtroom. You can only outlive it, and I have found that a whisper outlives a man. You had no reason to believe me, he said suddenly, turning to her, in the ballroom. You had every reason in the world to step back with the rest of them. Why did you not? And do not tell me it was because no one else would. I want the true one. Clara opened her mouth and found, for once, that she did not have the answer ready. I do not entirely know, she said at last, and it was the most honest thing she had ever told anyone. I only knew I could not. He crossed half the room toward her then, the closest he had come, and stopped, and the distance between them was suddenly the loudest thing in the house. He did not touch her. He looked as though he wanted to and had forgotten how, or was afraid that if he began he would not be able to stop, and Clara stood very still and felt her own pulse in her throat and did not step back. You had no cause, he said again, quietly, to believe me. No, she agreed. I had none at all. I believed you anyway. I have come to think that is the only kind of believing that means anything. The moment stretched, 1 heartbeat, 2, 3, and then a log settled in the grate with a soft collapse, and the spell broke, and he stepped back into his careful distance, and the afternoon was over. But something had changed in the room, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. It went on like that through the deep of the winter, and into the first raw edge of spring. He found her in the library, on the frost-bright terrace, at the quiet margins of the few rooms that would still receive his great-aunt, and therefore, grudgingly, him, once on the terrace. The wind took Clara's glove from her hand, and he caught it against his own chest, and when he gave it back their fingers rested together for a moment longer than a glove required, and neither drew away, and neither of them spoke of it. His desire was plain on the page of him to anyone who cared to read, and how his voice changed when he said her name. In the length of the silences he let stand rather than end. Clara read it, and did not dare yet to believe it was more than gratitude, and the Duke, who had not hoped for anything in 10 years, did not know how to tell her that it was. You should send me away, he told her once, on the terrace, with the early crocuses pushing up through the frost at the border. You must know that. Every hour you spend in my company spends something you cannot get back. A reputation is like a fortune, Clara. It is far easier to lose than to build, and you have so little of either that you cannot afford the smallest waste of it. You have a great deal to say about what I can afford, Clara said, for a man who has never once asked me what I want. That stopped him. Then, I am asking you now. I want to be spoken to as though I have a mind, which you do, and I have thanked God for it more than once this winter. I want not to be managed for my own good, which every soul who has ever housed me has done, and which you are doing at this very moment. And I want, she said, and here her voice did not hold quite as level as she wished it, to stop pretending that I come out to this cold terrace for the view. The silence after that was a long one. I am under a shadow, he said at last. I have nothing to offer that is not already stained by it. Then we are well matched, Your Grace, for I have nothing to offer at all, and I have never yet let it stop me. You are afraid. I do not blame you for it. But you have mistaken your fear for consideration and dressed it up as kindness, and I have worn enough turned gowns in my life to know a made-over thing the moment I see one. He looked at her then, as a man looks at a door he had spent 10 years believing was a wall. The county tested her once, deliberately, at a card party Lady Augusta could not decently avoid. When Clara entered the room, a stout matron rose from the whist table and moved, with great ceremony, to another, and two younger women rose and followed her, and the message was plain enough for a child to read across a crowded room. Clara sat down at the abandoned table alone, and took up the cards, and shuffled them, and did not so much as change color. The Duke crossed the floor and sat down across from her. "You need not," Clara said quietly. "You will only make it worse for yourself. They will say I have snared you at cards as they say I snared you at the dance." "Let them," he said, and picked up his hand. "I have spent a decade being told where I may and may not sit by people who have never once been right about anything at all. I find I have lately developed a taste for sitting precisely where I please. Whose deal is it? Yours." She watched him sort his cards with the same guarded neatness he brought to everything. "You are enjoying this. I am enjoying watching you pretend that you are not. You play to win, I think." "I have never once in my life been able to afford to lose," Clara said. "It is not a taste, Your Grace. It is a habit of survival, and it does not politely switch itself off at a card table merely because the stakes are pennies." "No," the Duke agreed, and something under his voice made her glance up. "I do not imagine that anything about you switches off merely because it would be convenient to someone. It is the thing I like best in you, and the thing that frightens me most, and I have not yet worked out which of the two I ought to trust." "Trust the first," said Clara. "The second is only the first in a borrowed coat." He laughed again, that startled and rusty sound, and across the room the stout matron turned to discover what a murderer could possibly find to laugh at, and found only a plain girl in gray beating a duke soundly at whist. Lady Augusta, who missed nothing, said only one thing on the subject, and she said it to Clara over the breakfast chocolate one gray morning. "He looks at you," the old woman said, "the way a man looks at a window after a long illness. Do you understand me?" "No, my lady." "Then you are a fool about the one thing you are otherwise clever about," said Lady Augusta, "and I shall have to be plain. I never believed the whisper. I knew that boy when he was a child, and I knew Isabel when she was a bride, and I know exactly the kind of man who could no more have hurt her than fly, and I have watched him die by inches under a lie for 10 years. You have done more for him in one winter than the whole of his blood has done in a decade. If he asks you a certain question, girl, I hope to God you will not let a gray gown answer it for you." Clara did not reply, but she folded that speech away and kept it, as she kept every kind thing anyone had ever said to her, which was to say carefully, because there had been so few. Lady Augusta cornered her great-nephew herself, one evening, in her own drawing-room with the door shut and Clara safely dispatched to bed. "You will tell me your intentions," the old woman said, "and you will make the whole of it plain, because that girl has spent her entire life being a convenience to people who never once considered hers, and I will not sit and watch you make her one more." "My intentions," the Duke repeated. "Do not echo me, Adrian. I am far too old for it. You call 3 times in a week. You have not called on any living soul 3 times in 10 years. You look at her as though she were the last warm room in a cold house. What is it you mean to do? What can I do?" he said, and there was something raw under the words. "Marry her? And hang the county round her neck for the rest of her life? Every door that is shut to me is shut to my wife. I would be binding her to the shadow, not the man inside it." "You would be asking her to marry the man," said Lady Augusta, "and the man would be asking her whether she would sooner have a whole safe life in the light being no one at all, or a real one in the shade, being loved? She has already answered that question once, before 300 people, with her hand held out in the open. I would suggest you do her the courtesy of believing her answer. He said nothing. I am afraid, he admitted finally, that she will wake some ordinary morning and count the cost of me and hate me for it. Then you do not know her, his great-aunt said, and you have no business loving her. But you do know her, so the fear is only cowardice wearing a warmer coat. And I raised you better than to confuse the two. Marry the girl, Adrian, before some braver and poorer man does it for you and you spend another 10 years alone, having learned nothing at all. It was at the season's final assembly, the grandest of them all, that the man named Varel chose to strike. He had been watching all winter, the fair-haired cousin of the dead Duchess, and he had been growing more frightened by the week, because a duke restored to society is a duke whose wife's death might be looked at again. And Varel of all men could not afford a second look. For it had been Varel, 10 years before, who had let Isabel go untended through the worst nights of her illness while he pursued the estate business that stood to profit him. Varel whose neglect had hurried her end, and Varel who had understood, standing at her graveside, that a murder rumor pointed at the grieving husband was the surest way to keep any suspicion from turning toward thee. Cousin who gained by her death. He had spread the whisper himself. He had fed it for 10 years. And now, a gray-gowned nobody was pulling the Duke back into the light, and if the light ever reached Isabel's last months, Varel would lose everything. So he forged a letter. He wrote it in a fair copy of Clara's own hand, which he had studied from a note she had left with a milliner, and in it the false Clara boasted to an invented friend that she had staged the whole business of the ballroom, the offered hand, the brave defiance, as a calculated scheme to snare a rich and ruined duke, whom no honest woman would have. He arranged for the letter to fall, at the height of the final assembly, into the hands of the county's greatest gossip. And he arranged, for the same night, that the family of a celebrated beauty named Miss Arabella Vaughan should announce her betrothal to the Duke, a match Varel had been quietly brokering for weeks, so that the gray schemer might be exposed and swept away, and the Duke safely married to a woman with no interest whatever in reopening old graves. The assembly rooms blazed that night as they had blazed at the season's beginning. Clara was there on Lady Augusta's arm, in a gown the old woman had insisted on giving her, still gray, but new gray, unturned, and she felt the change in the room the moment she entered it, the particular electric hush of a crowd that knows something the victim does not. The gossip read the letter aloud. She did it beautifully, in a carrying voice upon a signal, and by the third sentence 300 faces had turned toward Clara Denton with the old, familiar hunger. I confess it to you, and you alone, the woman read. The whole affair was my design from the first. A ruined duke is still a duke. I had only to walk across a floor and look brave, and the fortune was as good as mine. You would laugh to see how easily the great are caught by a plain face and a bold gesture. The woman lowered the letter into a silence gone suddenly vicious. It is signed, she said, Clara Denton. And it is in her hand. Well, said Miss Arabella Vaughan's mother, into that silence, with great satisfaction, I think that settles the character of the person His Grace has been keeping company with all winter. How fortunate that His Grace's own arrangements are so very much more suitable. My daughter, your daughter, said Clara, and her voice was not loud, but it cut through the room the way it had cut through it in January. Will forgive me if I ask to see the letter first. The county turned to her, expecting tears, expecting flight. She gave them neither. She walked, as she had walked once before, across the cleared and staring floor, and she took the forged letter from the gossip's unresisting fingers, and she read it through. And then she looked up, and she was, of all things, almost smiling. "It is a very good hand," she said. "It is nearly mine. But it is not mine, and I can prove it is not, and before this evening is out I will prove a great deal more than that." She turned, unhurried, to the crowd. "You have all been so eager, all these long years, to believe the worst of a man on no evidence at all. Let us see tonight how you do with actual evidence. Dr. Merrick, you are here. I asked Lady Augusta to see that you were. Will you come forward?" An elderly physician made his way through the parting crowd, a leather folio under his arm, and the room's certainty began, for the first time, to waver. Dr. Merrick attended the first Duchess of Ravenmore through the whole of her final illness, Clara said. He kept a record, as careful physicians do. He has kept it for 10 years, because no one ever asked to see it, because no one ever wanted the truth when the whisper was so much more entertaining. Doctor, in your own words and your own hand, of what did Isabel, Duchess of Ravenmore, die? "Of a wasting sickness of the blood," said Dr. Merrick, and his old voice was steady, and it reached every corner of the room. "A disease I diagnosed 2 full years before her death and recorded at every stage. I have here my notes, dated and signed as I made them, week upon week. There was no violence in it. There was no poison in it. There was nothing in it any living hand could have prevented. His Grace sat beside her every night I attended her, and I will swear to that before God and this county and any magistrate you care to summon." He laid the folio open upon a table where any who wished might see the dated pages. "The Duke of Ravenmore did not kill his wife. His wife was killed by nothing but the thing that was killing her, and I have said so, in writing, for 10 years. To a world that did not care to ask. A physician may write what he pleases," Varel said quickly, turning to the crowd, spreading his hands, reaching for the old easy current that had served him a decade. "A physician may be paid to write it. Are we to overturn everything this county has known for 10 years on the strength of one old man's notebook? Any of us might keep such a notebook. Any of us might date it as we chose. Then you will have no objection," Dr. Merrick said, without heat, "to my notes being read against the parish register of the dates I was summoned to Ravenmore, which the rector keeps, and which no man can forge, for I entered his church by his own door and signed his own book on each occasion. Shall we send for it, sir? I have all evening." "I have, in fact, 10 years. Varel had no answer to that. Clara watched the current he had reached for fail to come, watched the faces around him turn from him one by one, and she understood that she was seeing a thing collapse that had taken a decade to build and would take only minutes to fall. The silence now was a different silence. It was the silence of 300 people discovering, all at once, what they had done. "That," said Clara, "is the truth of the death you have hanged him for. Now let us have the truth of the letter." She turned, and she looked directly, now at the fair-haired man standing rigid at the front of the crowd. "Miss Varel, you are Isobel's cousin. You were at her graveside. You have been at every gathering this winter where the Duke was spoken against. You have, I think, a great deal of experience with other people's handwriting." "This is monstrous," Varel said. "I will not stand here and be accused by a schemer," Clara said. "By a fortune huntress? You wrote those words for me not an hour ago. It seems a pity to waste them." She held up the forged letter. "This is a forgery. I say it is your forgery, and I say that a man who can forge one letter has very likely, at some point in 10 careful years, written one true one he should not have. Lady Augusta? The old woman came forward, and there was nothing frail in her now. From her reticule she drew a single folded paper, yellowed with age, and she held it up beside the forgery, so the candlelight fell on both. "I have kept this for 10 years, Lady Augusta said, as Dr. Merrick kept his notes, and for the same reason. It is a letter my great-nephew's steward found among the estate papers after Isabel died, and could make no sense of, and gave to me. It is written by the man who was managing the Ravenmore accounts in the season of her death. It complains, in the writer's own hand, that the Duchess's illness is inconvenient to certain arrangements he has been making for his own profit, and that he cannot be forever dancing attendance at a sickbed when there is money to be moved. It is dated the very week she took her worst turn, the week she was left alone. It is signed with a flourish I have looked at, these 10 years, without knowing whose it was." She laid it down upon the table beside the forged letter and the doctor's folio, and she looked at Varel, and she smiled the terrible smile of the very old. "But you have all seen his signature tonight. He signs the assembly book at every ball. Fetch it. Lay the 3 hands side by side. And then tell me, County, whose hand wrote a poor girl's confession, and whose hand grudged a dying woman her husband's care." They fetched the book. The 3 hands lay side by side on the table in the blazing candlelight, and the whole county filed past to look, and there was no need for any of them to be a scholar. The forged confession and the old estate letter had been written by the same pen. The flourish was the same, the cramped tail on the letter G was the same, the whole cowardly slope of the thing was the same. And the assembly book, where Varel had signed himself in his own vain hand not 2 hours before, made it 3. "You let him," someone said, into the ruin, an old lord who had shunned the Duke for a decade, and whose voice now shook. "You let us all believe. For 10 years. To save yourself." "It was the sickness," Varel said. He had gone the color of tallow. "It was the sickness that killed her. Merrick said so himself. I did nothing. Neglect is not murder." "Neglect is not, no," said the Duke. He had not spoken until now. He had stood apart from it all, as still as he had stood in January, and let a gray-gowned woman fight his 10-year war for him, because she had asked him, with one look, to trust her to win it. Now he came forward into the center of the room, into the space the county cleared for him from long habit, and this time the space did not feel like contempt. It felt like a stage. "Neglect is not murder," the Duke agreed. "You are quite right, Varel. You did not kill her. You only let her die a little faster than she needed to, because there was money to be moved, and then you spent 10 years letting the world believe I had done what you had merely permitted, because a hanged husband asks no questions about the accounts. You did not take her life. You took mine. You took 10 years of it, and you took her good name, which you turned into a rope for me, and I find, standing here, that I have run entirely out of patience with your health." He turned from Varel as one turns from a thing already dealt with. "You will be gone from this county by morning, and from this country by the month. And every door that has been closed to me for 10 years will be closed to you for the rest of your life. I will see to it personally. It will be the great pleasure of my restoration." Varel went. There was nothing else left for him to do, and the crowd that had drawn back from the Duke for a decade drew back now from the cousin instead, and let him pass through them, and out into the dark, and no hand was offered to him. Not one. And he understood at last exactly what he had done, because he had done it to a better man for 10 years. And then the Duke turned to Clara Denton, and the whole assembled county, which had come to watch a poor girl destroyed, watched instead the thing it had never once expected to see. "You crossed that floor in January," he said, and he did not lower his voice, because he wanted every soul in the room to hear it, "when you had no reason on earth to believe me, and every reason to leave me standing alone as everyone always had. I asked you why. You told me you did not entirely know. I have thought about very little else since." He stopped before her. "I know why. You did it because you are the only person I have ever met who looks at a thing with her own eyes before she lets the world tell her what she sees. And I have been standing at the far end of every room I share with you all winter, telling myself that a man under a shadow has no right to reach for the light. And I am done with it. I am done being careful. Clara Denton. I chose you the moment you set down that fan and started walking, and I have gone on choosing you every day since, and I would very much like, in front of all these people who once could not stand near me, to be permitted to choose you out loud." "You had no cause to believe me either," Clara said. And her eyes were bright, and her back was very straight. "A ruined man, a woman with nothing. You might have thought exactly what they wanted you to think." "I never once did," he said. "Not for a moment." "Finish it, Clara. You began a sentence on my terrace in the winter and never ended it. End it now." "I believe you," Clara said. "I believed you when it was foolish, and I believe you now that it is proven. And I find the believing has become something I cannot take back and do not wish to. I put my hand into yours in January because I would not damn a man unheard." She lifted her bare hand in front of them all, exactly as she had lifted it once before, in exactly the same room, and this time there was no fear anywhere in it. "I put it into yours now because I have heard you, all of you, and I choose him, freely, knowing everything. I choose him." The Duke took her hand, and this time it did not tremble, and this time, when the county gasped, it was a different sound entirely. The betrothal of Miss Arabella Vaughan was not announced that night. Her mother had a headache and retired early, and the Vaughans were among the first families to send their cards to Ravenmore within the fortnight, all their arrangements forgotten, all their memories conveniently short, and Lady Augusta received their cards, and read the names aloud, and dropped every one of them into the fire with an expression of the profoundest contentment. They were married in the spring. There was no need to describe the church or the crowd, because the marriage was not the moment, and everyone who mattered already understood that the moment had happened on a polished floor in January, when a girl in a twice-turned gown had crossed an empty room and offered her hand to a man the whole world had turned from. The wedding was only the county catching up to a thing already decided. A year later, in the bright garden of a house that no one whispered about anymore, the Duchess of Ravenmore sat in the full green light of a summer afternoon with her husband beside her and their child on a blanket between them. A small, dark-eyed creature with his father's storm-gray gaze and his mother's habit of looking very seriously at things before deciding what she thought of them. The great London house had its windows open now. The doors that had been shut for 10 years stood open too, and the county that had feared the Duke now dined at his table, and if he had wanted revenge he might have had a great deal of it, and he wanted none. Dignity, he had found, outlasts cruelty, and it does not require an audience as cruelty does. Clara had given away the gray gowns. All of them, even the new one Lady Augusta had bought her, folded and sent to a girl in the village who had no others, because Clara remembered exactly what it was to own 2 dresses and a borrowed name. She wore color now, colors she chose herself, greens and warm golds, and once, to a ball, a deep and unrepentant crimson that made the whole room turn. And she had discovered that she did not mind being looked at, now that she was looked at by people who saw her. "Do you ever think," her husband asked her, that summer afternoon, watching their daughter reach with great determination for a bee she was not going to be permitted to catch, of what would have happened if you had stayed by the wall, if you had held the fan and done as you were told? "No," Clara said. "I think of it never. A person only has so many afternoons, and I do not intend to spend any of mine imagining the wall." She reached over and moved the baby a prudent distance from the bee. "Besides, you would still be standing in the middle of that room, and no one would have come, and that is a thing I find I cannot bear to think about even now that it cannot happen." "Someone would have come," he said. "Eventually someone did come," said Clara. "I was there." He took her hand, in the ordinary way of a man who has taken his wife's hand 10,000 times and still notices every one, and they sat in the bright garden and watched their child, and the long shadow that had lain over Ravenmore for 10 years was so entirely gone that their daughter would grow up never knowing it had been there at all. Which was, in the end, the finest revenge either of them ever took. And neither thought of it as revenge, but only as the ordinary happiness of people who had been believed. Thank you for listening to the very end of this story. If it stayed with you, I hope you will tell me in the comments which city you are listening from tonight, and whether you think you would have crossed that floor as Clara did, or whether you would have stayed safely by the wall. Would you have offered your hand to a man the whole world had turned from? Or would you have waited for someone braver to go first? Stay a while, and subscribe if you would like to sit with us again. And until the next quiet hour, sleep well.